Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, What to Watch, H1 2024 TV Ad Spending Trends. I'm your host, Becky Schilling, Senior Director of Content at eMarketer, coming to you from New York City, and I'm joined by my colleague, Senior Analyst Ross Benesch, who's here with me in the studio today. Hey, Ross.
Hey, Becky. Good to be here.
Great to have you. We are so excited to have everyone with us. Before we get into the main presentation, I'd like to thank Mountain for making today's webinar possible and welcome Severin Nesselhoff, Director of Marketing Strategy at Mountain. Severin is joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Hello, Severin.
Hi, Becky. Hi, Ross. Excited to be here.
Thanks again for joining. A few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We'll email you a link with the slides and the recording of today's presentation. We'd love for you to engage with us in the chat throughout the show to hear your thoughts on the TV advertising landscape and any questions you may have. Use the chat window on the right of your screen to submit questions at any time during the presentation. We'll get to as many as we can during our live Q&A later on. So with that, Ross, let's get started.
Well, thanks, Becky. So I want to just kick out this conversation going with traditional TV ad spending because it's where most money comes into in this field. So this year is actually going to be a pretty decent year for TV ad spending. And by decent, it's just not going to fall. So TV ad spending is going to be slightly up, and this is US specific, by the way. And slightly up is good news for an industry that continues to decline by double digits basically every other year. And the reason that we're going to see a slight bump this year is due to the Olympics on the national side and politics on the local spending side. And linear TV used to be the anchor for a lot of media plans. If we took this forecast back further a few years before COVID, you'd see that it was responsible for more than a fifth, closer to a third of total media spending. And now it's declined all the way down to 15%. By the end of our forecast period, linear TV is going to represent less than 10% of total ad spending in the US. So, this year's a good year for TV ad sellers, but next year it goes back to reality with a negative 13% decline, and it's basically in secular decline at this point. This just gives you a little more context on the political ad spending that's coming into TV and propping up those numbers for this year. So this year, we're seeing a record amount of total political ad spending in the US, and most of it's still going through television. Over half of it's going through TV. And even though that share is down from when it was about 2/3 during the last during the last presidential election, it's still overwhelmingly a traditional channel. So if you look at total ad spending in the United States, only about a fourth of it is going towards traditional media. If you look at political spending, more than half goes to television alone. And that has a big effect on the rest of the market when that much money comes in. It's just a big infusion that props up the rest of the market. So political spending is primarily local. If we look at national, we see a slightly different picture, but we also see that it's still declining basically every year. This year, it's going to be flat due to the influence of the Olympics, injecting a few $1 billion into national TV ad spend. But national mimics the broader story of total TV. Its share is slowly eroding. It used to be more than 2/3 of total TV spending. Now it's just under that, but it's pretty consistent on a year-by-year basis. And just to give you some more context, because the upfronts had just happened, like all those events had just happened in the past month, this is the type of inventory that's being sold in the upfronts. It's the national inventory that's being sold by the TV networks. That's a little bit different than the local inventory that's sold by the cable companies and the providers. But as national TV ad spending declines, marketers just need to consider that it's going to become harder to use TV for its traditional purpose, which was mass consumer awareness and generating reach. When the national reach is lower, you have to start to be creative in how you're divvying up that ad inventory. Now, of course, there's a lot of money coming into streaming. So the decline in linear spending is only really half the story. The other half is that CTV is seeing a huge bump in ad spending. And this year, we were actually going to lower our growth forecast. So we were still expecting more spend coming in, but we were expecting the growth to go from around 20% to start to be in the low 10s per year, just as the medium matures. But we actually raised our growth and added a few $1 billion to our forecast when we last updated it. And that was primarily due to the launch of ads on Prime Video. So Amazon in January made advertising tiers the default for Prime Video users. And that's going to generate a few $1 billion immediately, basically. And that raises everything in this industry to be closer toward $30 billion. And our CTV definition is kind of broad. So we're looking at any digitally sold advertising that appears on a TV screen. So that includes YouTube, which is a major component. In fact, it's the largest ad seller in this sphere. Now, CTV is going to see some influence from politics, kind of like linear has, but not nearly to the degree. With CTV, political spending is growing tremendously. It's growing faster in CTV than it is in any other channel, but it represents still a small portion of total spend. So it's growing fast because it's from a small base. But the streaming services are getting more active in this field. So if we look back at like the last presidential election, you had audio and video streaming services like Spotify and Hulu that said they didn't want political ads because they're controversial. Now they've reversed that and they welcome them, and they're all over those services now. Now this slide just puts everything into perspective that we have been talking about. So you could see the share of total CTV and TV that's going to each category. The black bar is CTV, the red bar is TV. When we did this forecast for the first time in 2019, just 5 years ago, CTV was 1/10 of the total. It was about $7 billion, and linear television was $70 billion. You go 5 years forward, CTV has gone from 1/10 to 1/3 of the total. And part of that is due to linear TV shrinking. So CTV looks better by comparison. But CTV has grown by 4x from 7 billion to 28 billion over a 5-year period. By the end of the forecast period in 2028, they're going to be on par with each other, basically. It's going to be half and half. So linear still is most money in this area, but that's changing very quickly. And it's going to happen to the point where over a 10-year period, CTV is going to go from 1/10 of linear to equaling it. Now, all that money from CTV has got to come from somewhere. And when advertisers are asked about it, like in this poll by the IAB and Advertiser Perceptions, they generally say that they pull money from linear TV to put into streaming, or they pull it from other digital video assets. And CTV is becoming more of a must-have for marketers, according to that survey. More marketers said that CTV was a must-buy compared to linear. A lot of that is due to the audience makeup. Obviously, CTV has a much younger audience with a higher lifetime value if you're able to reach them now. And this last point by Paramount's advertising president just raised kind of an interesting trend to me. So because all this new inventory is coming in from Amazon having a new ad tier and Netflix and Disney Plus also adding advertising not too long ago, there has been a huge growth in ad inventory supply. And that, in theory, should lower the ad prices. But what Paramount was saying was that when these new services come on, primarily Amazon, they're bringing in more types of advertisers who weren't active in TV before. There's a lot of companies, a lot of small retailers and CPG companies that sell their services on Amazon and already advertise there, but haven't been super active in streaming or in linear. And now that Amazon and others all have these ad tiers, they have more incentive to become active, and there's also more inventory. So prices are stabilizing, in some cases declining, but due to that new demand of advertisers, it's canceling out some of that increase in ad supply that we had been seeing. Now, this chart just breaks down cord cutting. So on the right here, we're looking at pay TV viewers versus non-pay TV. And pay TV viewers here, we're looking at the broadest way we can categorize them. So that includes traditional pay TV, that's cable, satellite, like if you have Comcast or Dish Network, but also digital pay TV. So digital pay TV, they're also known as vMVPDs or skinny bundles. That's YouTube TV, Hulu at Live TV, Sling, Fubo. Even if you include all of those services, by next year, the number of people who don't pay for live television will outnumber those who do pay for it. And if you were looking solely at traditional, that change already happened about 2 years ago. So cord cutting is happening at a tremendous rate, even if you're generous and factor in these digital services. Now, on the left-hand side, you see the different types and just how big they are. The traditional TV is much larger than the digital pay TV. And digital pay TV, they launched around 2015, a lot of these services. So within 4 years, they added 10 million households. It's going to take another 9 years before they go from 10 million, 20 million. The growth has slowed down a lot.
Now, Ross, why has digital pay TV growth slowed down so much?
Well, Becky, so what's happened is that when these services launched, they were super cheap. Sling TV was like $25 a month. You could get all these channels, and they were losing money. They just wanted to gain subscribers. It was to habituate people into this new service. They eventually had to raise prices because retransmission fees had risen, and they want to stop losing so much money. So now that they're priced like cable, where it's like $80 a month or more, not as many people want them. It's not as great of a value. So there are cord cutters who are leaving traditional pay TV for digital pay TV, but the replacement rate is like under a third at this point. And if we look at total viewers in streaming versus TV, streaming is actually going to pass TV this year. We're going to have slightly more CTV viewers in the United States this year than we'll have linear TV viewers. And this has been a trend that's been working toward this inflection point for better part of a decade, but it's finally here. And this is just viewers, though. I don't want to say that there's more time spent in TV, because TV is still where most ad spending happens. But CTV is not just an add-on anymore. It can be used for reach. Clearly, it's hitting over 230 million people a month in the United States. So this chart here goes further and breaks down the usage. So we're looking at time spent, and we're looking at time spent with video as a whole. So if we look at all of the subscription OTT, social video, and television, linear TV went from being about 2/3 of all the time people spend watching those types of services to under half. And meanwhile, YouTube and subscription OTT have gained a lot of share. But you can still see that subscription OTT has more viewing time right now than, linear TV has more viewing time right now than subscription OTT and social video combined. So there's still a lot of viewing in linear, but it's losing share very quickly. And as that happens, it's going to lead to a reduction of total ad inventory for advertisers. So Brian Weiser of Madison Wall has forecasted that over the next 3.5 years, the total amount of inventory in streaming and TV combined is going to shrink by 1/4. That's due to streaming has lighter ad loads, fewer minutes per hour, and a lot of streaming services have viewership that leans ad-free. Like most Netflix viewers do not see ads. They opt out of that. And that just means advertisers are going to have to reconsider how they use TV for reach and maybe make it more targetable if there's fewer impressions that go around.
Now, you mentioned YouTube. How does YouTube compare to other streaming services in terms of time spent?
So YouTube is the largest. YouTube is gigantic. If you look at YouTube compared to any other company, the only one that has more time spent than them, according to Nielsen, is Disney. And that's Disney's linear plus digital. It's just slightly above YouTube. YouTube is more than 10%, or right about 10% of total time spent with TV and streaming. Netflix is right behind them. And after those two, there's no one else in sight. Those two are each about 1/10 of the usage in this field. And any other individual service is much lower. Disney as a company is very high. That's 3 streaming services plus a handful of TV networks to get to that point. Now, I added this slide here about Max, the artist formerly known as HBO, because it is our newest forecast. We've had a lot of new forecasts in CTV. Every half year or so, we try to add a few new companies. Max is the newest one we add. It's not huge. It's about the size of Paramount Plus. It's taken up, between 1 and 2% of the CTV market, around $500 million a year. But consider that Max did not have any advertising until about 3 years ago. HBO historically did not have ads. That's how they were able to make great shows like Sopranos and The Wire, which would have been very controversial for advertisers to appear back in the 90s. But since pushing that ad tier just a few years ago, Max has gotten 1/5 of their new subscribers or total subscribers to be ad supported. Their new subscribers opt in at a slightly higher rate. And Max is going to grow their ad inventory even faster by adding live sports. Recently, they have a Bleacher Report hub on there where you can watch all the sports that they offer on their affiliated linear channel. So like the Major League Baseball games that are on TBS or all the basketball games that are on TNT, those have come to Max, and that should help boost the ad revenue a little bit. And this gives you some sense on how Max then fits into the whole landscape. So they're at the bottom, right around where Paramount is. We have nearly a dozen other services that we break out ad revenues for. And we're at the point now where we have 5 companies that are going to exceed $1 billion in US ad sales just in CTV. And we're soon going to probably have 7 or 8. And that's a big change from 2019 during the first forecast when it was just YouTube, Hulu, Roku had that amount. Now we have, large scaled ad businesses all around for advertisers to spread their money throughout. And everything here listed is about 3/4 of the total market. So if you compare this spending to what we showed earlier in total CTV, this is what we break out individually. There's still about 1/4 that goes to other. Part of that other goes to YouTube creators because this is looking at a net basis. On a gross basis, you need to add about $2 billion more to YouTube's figure, and that's the revenue that is held by all of its creator and influencer partners. And then there's a lot of ad tech vendors. I mean, just look at the CTV Lumascape. There's a lot of companies that have businesses in this field that are helping advertisers. And then there's other companies that are selling inventory that aren't large enough to break out. A lot of small streaming services and device makers. So there are some device makers on here because this is total Amazon, not just Prime Video. That includes the inventory they're selling through Fire TV. And Roku's ad inventory is obviously heavily influenced by what they sell through their OS because they sell about 1/3 of the total inventory of publisher apps that are on their service. But there's also LG, Samsung, Vizio that are selling inventory both as a revenue share of the apps that are on their smart TVs, but then they also have their free streaming services that are directly embedded in there, and they're selling a portion of that ad inventory as well. And you add all those up together, and you get the remaining 1/4 on how we get to a nearly $30 billion market. So that was looking at total ad revenue per company. This chart looks at ad revenue per ad-supported viewer. Basically, how effectively are these streaming services monetizing their ad-supported audience? So Netflix's total ad revenues are not great. They're just under $1 billion, which is much smaller than their subscription business, which is around $15 billion in the US alone. But they have few ad-supported viewers. For those that they do have, they're monetizing very effectively. They generate a lot of time spent. Netflix viewers watch about an hour per day of Netflix. That's much greater than any of the other streaming services that we have on this chart. And they have high CPMs. When they first launched, the Wall Street Journal reported their CPMs are about $65. Now they've lowered, they're probably between 40 and 50, but it's still higher than the norm, which is generally $25 to $35 CPMs. So between high ad prices and high time spent, they can generate a lot per viewer. On the flip side of that, Paramount Plus generates a little bit less ad revenue per viewer due to the low amount of time spent. And this number is annualized, by the way. That's not $62 per month for Netflix. That's $62 per year. So, about $5 per month in ad revenue per ad-supported viewer is the way to look at that. All right, and this goes just a little bit further in breaking out ad-supported viewership for streaming services. It's something that we only started forecasting last year. We've had the total viewership for these services for a long time, but now we're able to break it out into ad-free and ad-supported. And Prime Video just right away when they turn on the ads, and most people got them, unless if they took the effort to go in and opt out, they generated more than 100 million viewers ad supported in that first month. Now they're more at like 130 million. And basically, they've inserted themselves to be at the top of this field right away, whereas the reverse is the ones that added advertising slowly over time, like Netflix and Max. They have a much smaller ad-supported audience.
And which services are relying the most on ad-supported viewers?
So it looks a little bit like this chart, but it's slightly different. If you break out the viewership per streaming service, that's like what share of their viewers are ad-supported. What you get is Prime Video is like 80% ad-supported. Peacock's almost 80% ad-supported, like 70-something. Hulu and Paramount are about 2/3 ad-supported, so Paramount would be a little bit higher on that chart. And then the rest of these are under half, although Disney Plus is adding ad-supported viewers pretty rapidly through their bundle. They'll be over half soon. And I should just point out that viewers that are longtime viewers are less likely to have advertising. So if you've had Netflix for 10 years, you're probably going to keep the ad-free plan. Statistically, that's what we're seeing right now. But if you're like signing up to a new promotion or a new bundle that they're offering, you're more likely to take the ad plan. That's why in their earnings call last quarter, Netflix said that about 40% of their new viewers are ad-supported. That's much higher than like the sub 10% of their total viewership that's ad-supported right now. So this presentation has been about advertising primarily, but I want to call to light subscription revenues because they're so gigantic in streaming. So what we're looking at here in the gray line is CTV ad revenues. It's our broadest estimate of streaming advertising. Like I said earlier, that's just any digitally sold advertising that appears on a TV set. The red chart is OTT subscription revenues. So just all the fees that people are paying, when you pay $15 a month to go for Netflix or $10 a month for Peacock, that's what's going into this bucket. And I excluded the digital pay TV services, also known as vMVPDs, because they would skew things. $100 YouTube TV package would skew this data a little bit if we're going to look at like for like. And what we see is even if we exclude that figure, subscription revenues are still 2/3 of the total money coming into this area. So streaming services have become more ad dependent than they used to be. That's certainly the case. Netflix has advertising now. But subscriptions are still where most of the revenue is going to be. And it's going to be that way for a while, even though the share that is coming from ads is growing. And this is a lot like what we're seeing with linear television. In linear television, subscription revenues are greater than ad revenues. Even when ad revenues peaked at around $70 billion a year in the US, subscription revenues were over $100 million, and $1 billion. And that's because cable bills were so expensive. So there's still going to be a lot of ad-free viewing because there's people paying a lot of money for that. And advertisers are just going to have to make do with that for now. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about content production because we're seeing a big change in that. And it ultimately affects which streaming services people sign up for, how they spend their time, and what advertisers advertise against, what shows they put their ads against. So for a long time, streaming services were launching tons of content constantly, and that was their way to acquire subscribers because subscriber additions was like the primary thing they were focused on, even if they were running a financial loss. Well, last year, there were the strikes, and there was also a lot of financial pressure put on entertainment conglomerates to show profits for their streaming ventures. And that led to a big cutback in the number of shows produced. And it's bared out through various sources. The one on the left is from FX. The one on the right is from Ampere Analysis, kind of shows the same thing, that TV production fell off a cliff last year. And this year, even though the strikes are resumed, it's been slow going, getting production back to its previous levels. There's a lot of people behind the scenes in Hollywood who are losing their jobs, who are fearful about job security. It's very likely we're going to see another cut in the number of shows produced. And there's still a lot of programming, certainly. And there's all the programming from previous years, too. So there's a big library to draw from for streaming services. But there's less new buzzy content for advertisers to be a part of, even though there is plenty. We're likely not going to see more than 600 scripted series in the US being greenlit annually like we were, just a year ago. But live sports is one area where they can plug some of those programming gaps. So all these streaming services have been signing live sports deals. Netflix has Christmas NFL games. They have sports adjacent, sports entertainment, if you will, pro wrestling coming next year. Amazon's likely going to get the NBA. They have some Yankees games. They have NFL Thursday night. Roku channel, which is a free station, has Sunday baseball games. And there's dozens of other ventures in live sports and streaming that have happened in the last 6 months. And now that they've paid all that money for it, that's going to be a big part of what's featured on the homepage. It's going to be what's in their upfront. It's going to be a big tent pole to bring in advertisers. This forecast here is from last year, and it showed that about a third of US viewers watch live sports at least once per month through a digital service. And that includes stuff like YouTube TV and Hulu with live TV. This number is going to get raised when we update this forecast in a few months due to all those announcements that I just shared. So it wouldn't be surprising if within the next year to 40% of the population will watch digital live sports in some fashion regularly. And just want to briefly go over everything I presented. CTV is 1/3 of the total spending in this area, up from 1/10 just 5 years ago. By the end of 2028, it's going to be half of spending on total TV. So the 5 services that have more than $1 billion in ad sales are going to be joined by a few others. If I give this presentation in a year, that number will probably be 7 or 8. It was 3 as of 2020. So there's more places to spread your money out now than there used to be. And for all the advertising growth that we're seeing, subscriptions is kind of stealthy in that it's still the primary way that these services make money, and it will be for the foreseeable future. With that, I'll kick it back to you, Becky.
Thank you, Ross. That was great. Thanks for setting the CTV landscape for us, from advertising to subscriptions and viewers. We will get back into it shortly with a special quick take conversation between Ross and our special guest, Severin Nesselhoff, Director of Marketing Strategy at Mountain. Don't worry if you joined us late. We'll email you a link with the slides and the recording of today's presentation after the broadcast. And a quick reminder that we'll be taking your questions live soon, so keep them coming. All right, Ross, back over to you and Severin.
Thank you. So, Severin, with all the opportunities for CTV advertising, is there a concern about battling fragmentation? And how can brands take steps to avoid the pitfalls of fragmentation?
Ross, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a daunting task, right? We just heard you walk us through the numbers to proliferation of streaming services, ad-supported streaming tiers within those streaming services. You have this almost ballooning effect within the industry. But also one thing you mentioned, which really resonated with me, is CTV is a must buy. So even if there's fragmentation, we as marketers have to address it and have to start working with it. And so, in my opinion, it really comes down to testing. It comes down to testing which channels, which platforms work for you, work for our brand. Is it something like, a ad-supported tier on Amazon Prime? Is it the ad-supported tier on Netflix? Is it a fast channel like Pluto TV? Is it a platform like Mountain? We reach 99% of all households in the US. It will come down to, is your choice going to drive more revenue, incremental revenue for your brand? And I think that's the key. Testing is going to be the key for addressing this fragmentation.
And you mentioned, the importance of a solid attribution model due to all that fragmentation. Well, what are some considerations that an advertiser should make when selecting an attribution model for CTV?
A great question. Believe it or not, when we run our studies, roughly when we hear back, 80% of marketers still are not happy with especially with the incrementality testing. So that's a big challenge to address. And for me, it comes down to 2 things. Number one is, and we'll get to this again when we talk about how to pull off effective incrementality testing. But number one is audience targeting. being able to target the audience you want to reach. So you're on par with other walled gardens such as Meta, such as TikToks of the world, paid social, even Amazon, now with Amazon Prime and Amazon on the shopping platform, you have a walled garden. So number one is understanding your targeting capabilities across these CTV platforms and providers, and how they fit in with your walled garden strategy. And then, of course, we come to the measurement piece of it. I think it's incredibly important that we understand how incrementality testing works, having a control group versus a test group, and seeing is the test group driving incremental revenue compared to your control group. But then, quite frankly, also looking at, is the CTV platform, is the streaming provider, the platform I'm running my ads on, is it allowing me to bring, for instance, a third-party measurement tool? Is it providing incrementality testing on the platform? So basically, the approach we've taken at Mountain is we provide you with incrementality reporting within our platform, but we also let you bring a third-party measurement provider such as Rockerbox, Trust but Verify. And I think those are two important components, audience targeting and incrementality testing and measurement capability, that will put you on a path to success for testing out incrementality of any new platform that you're adding to your mix. Because I do believe CTV has to earn its place in your marketing mix, or each channel individually has to earn its place in your marketing mix.
So after a marketer's added CTV, selected an attribution model that best works for their business goals, how can they tell that their strategy is really working?
It's a great question, because it also sometimes, if you flip it around, is a lot of times we hear, especially from customers that come to us, we used to have something like 90% of first-time TV advertisers. Now, of course, that's changing as CTVs as a whole is getting more adoption. A lot of times, actually, we hear it hasn't been working as well, CTV as a whole, or there's been concerns that the measurement wasn't right. And if I can just leave the audience with some actual pieces of advice. Number one, when you talk about running a successful incrementality test, is number one, don't overload your test group in terms of already having maxed out all your other marketing channels with that test group. There has to be a place for CTV to really shine and come and bring its strength. So having enough money behind the CTV test and not having that audience already saturated too much for other channels. Otherwise, that incrementality that CTV will certainly bring might be diluted by just having maxed out that audience already. And then the other component, I mentioned this during the previous question, is audience targeting. You have to be able to really zero in on the audience that you want to include in your control group. Again, on par with your other proven marketing channels such as Meta, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. And here I would, again, with a piece of advice, the way we do it at Mountain, just today we announced Mountain Match, that is keyword-based audiences, AI-powered keyword-based audiences that let you be really granular in how you segment out the audiences that you're trying to reach with your CTV ads, and then bring it all back to the incrementality best practices, the testing best practices, and seeing that lift in revenue, because ultimately we believe that CTV should and will be, but should be a revenue driver for your brand. In our case, we attributed 15 billion in incremental revenue to our advertising partners. And I think that's sort of the standard that you should hold any CTV platform to when you consider who to add and which platform to add to your mix.
Thank you, Severin. And with that, I kick it back to Becky.
Thank you, Ross and Severin. Know your audience. That's always great advice for anyone out there. We've received quite a few audience Q&A questions, so let's get started. Ross, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned a couple of times upfronts. What's going on with the upfronts?
Well, so what we're seeing is that most money that's going to come into this upfront is still linear TV, but it's not going to be that way for much longer. So linear is going to be down. Streaming is going to be up. It's going to be up enough that the total is going to be up. Prices are going to come a little bit down, and linear is having like a last hurrah as the primary anchor of the upfronts. Next year, it might be different.
A question that I'm going to ask of you, Severin. Do I need to buy individually from each channel like Netflix, Amazon, etc., to make the most of my dollars on CTV?
A great question. I think, and I almost don't want to repeat myself. I think that there's no one size fits all answer, because it always depends on the audience you want to buy, and where you believe you can reach that audience most effectively. And again, knowing what most effectively means, I think comes down to testing, incrementality testing. Again, if I just put that against what we do at Mountain, we pride ourselves in an audience first approach, right? We pipe into over 150 streaming channels, reaching 99% of US households. That sort of gives you basically complete coverage. But again, this also means you have to bring in your approach to testing if the channels, the platforms that you're adding to your mix are driving the results that you want to see. And I think that's for each marketer to decide what's your benchmark and what do you want to see from a CTV provider surpassing in terms of that benchmark of driving revenue.
And then Ross, you mentioned this in your presentation, bundles. So why are so many streaming services creating bundles?
Well, I ask myself that every day when there's a new bundle that comes out. But the answer comes down to churn. Streaming services want to keep people around. Streaming is very easy to cancel and to go to a competitor. Bundling it should, in theory, make it more difficult for people to cancel, or at least make them less likely to cancel. And then they can make money on the passive income from all the streaming services you aren't using, but still paying for, a lot like basic cable.
And then we had a question from the audience about creative. So Severin, I'm going to pose this one to you. As a linear TV advertiser, should I be making new creative specifically for CTV? And will I be able to test my creative on CTV?
I think that's a great question because yes and no. I mean, if you already have TV ready assets, they're CTV ready. The big difference that I would encourage every creative and every marketer to think about is that now with CTV, you're much more granular in how you can match your creative to an audience. A very specific example, we have a brand partner, Rumble, they make outdoor blankets. They're able to use different creative and how the blanket might be used in the home or outside in the great outdoors based on the audience. There's aspiring outdoor enthusiasts, so it's maybe sure more of the creative of using the blanket at home versus they're targeting an audience for the true outdoor enthusiasts who are outdoors, chose the blanket more in action outdoors. So I think to get onto CTV, if you already have TV assets, you're good to go. If you want to really fine-tune your CTV creative strategy, then using the data to be more and more granular and how do you use your creative to match it with the audience that you're after, I think is best practice.
Great. We had another question from the audience about shifting budgets for CTV. So I'll pose this one to both of you gentlemen. Ross, maybe you take a stab at it first. Which industry or vertical brands in particular are shifting more ad budget to CTV? And to what extent are those verticals legacy linear spenders? Are they new to TV ad spenders?
There's a lot of legacy TV advertisers on CTV. Like when I watch Hulu or Max, I mean, I see a lot of State Farm, Progressive, Geico. I think insurance is putting a lot in CTV. Automotive certainly is. I'm not discounting the new advertisers. They're certainly coming, especially with that Prime Video ad tier. But I often see a lot of the same brands on CTV that I see on linear, and auto and insurance seem heavily invested in this field.
Severin, if I'm a first-time TV advertiser, what should be my first step to add CTV to my ad strategy?
That is a great question because I think it as a first-time TV advertiser, it sounds and feels more daunting to get onto CTV than it actually is. That's why I'm a big fan of, I mean, obviously, but I'm a big fan of CTV because it is, if you run video on social, and use that as a performance marketing channel, you're already 80%, 90% of the way to also running it on CTV. It is really just finding that platform that feels, now if I'm talking to performance marketers, find a platform that feels most natural to you, that you're used to from running social video. A CTV platform like Mountain, we've built like a performance TV, like a performance marketing platform. So you bring your assets, you upload them, you select your audience, and you're off to the races. So in a way, getting started with CTV as a first-time TV advertiser has never been easier, in my opinion. And again, if you have social video assets, usually they're fairly straightforward to also convert into CTV-ready assets with a few exceptions. But again, there's also services and products out there to help you do that. And you're off to the races. And I think, again, easier. And I think, Ross, the data that you've shown, just an increase in ad spend, it's also a reflection of it's never, in my opinion, been easier as an advertiser to be on the big screen in the living room like today.
And there are a lot of alphabet soup whenever we start talking about this topic. And one of those is OTA, over the air. How popular is that, Ross?
So it's grown a little bit. It's still somewhat niche, but it's about 15% of the US population is using an antenna to get their television. It's free. So that's the great thing, but it can be a little bit cumbersome to get the stations, especially if you're in New York City. I find that if you stick it outside the window and plaster it on your wall or put it on your window AC or in the fire escape, it works much better than if you have it within your home.
Some tips for those of you in New
life
York
hack
City. We tapped on this a little bit earlier, but is there any way to truly achieve reach with CTV given how fragmented and the number of players there are? Severin, you want to take a stab at that first?
Again, I would bring this back to the expectations that we should all bring to the CTV platform that we're advertising on in terms of reach, in terms of audience, targeting capabilities, getting reporting from those platforms on to what extent you're maxing out those audiences. I think the one piece of advice that I would leave advertisers with is just like on paid social, paid search, we are mindful of the frequency caps that we put in place to ensure that we're not maxing out audiences. That's what I would really encourage all of us to bring that mindset over into CTV. It is fragmented. We have to evaluate different players, but don't sort of leave your performance TV, performance marketing thinking at the doorstep to CTV. Bring that and expect audience targeting, frequency reporting, and just overall reporting capabilities, as I mentioned, also through third parties, to ensure that as you're adding new platforms to your mix, you have the reporting that you're looking for, both in terms of in-platform and across platforms incrementality-wise. And then I think it's you can find your success formula there by adding and testing out different CTV platforms and providers.
Right. And then Ross, I'm going to ask you to channel a little bit of one of our colleagues, Evelyn, who covers our programmatic. One of the audience members asked, how do I know if I should buy programmatic or direct from CTV?
I guess it depends on what your goals are. I mean, if you're trying to scale quickly, get inventory cheaply, buy across many apps at the same time, programmatic would probably be the way to go. Direct would be a little bit harder to do those things, but you would get more visibility into the individual shows that your ads are going to run on. You'd get a little bit more control. So if there's like some new type of ad format that's really custom that a streaming service is selling, or you want to be like really on a particular show on that service, probably go direct. But if you're just trying to place ads in front of as many people as possible, as easily as possible, then programmatic. But it's not necessarily a dichotomy though, because you can buy direct from streaming services programmatic. But I think what they meant is using like a third-party DSP sort of situation.
All right, unfortunately, we have time for only one more question today, we haven't brought it up yet, but it is cookies. How will the eventual deprecation of cookies and potential IP impact targeting and reporting for CTV, and how do you see targeting evolving? Severin, would you like to take a first crack at that one?
Sure, I think that's again where I would look to the platforms such as Mountain for answers. I mean, say our targeting technology and reporting technology is based off of location matching, ID matching, device ID graph matching. So I do believe that the ultimate or eventual demise of the cookie makes it even more important. And again, apologies if I'm repeating myself, but makes it even more important to have measurement in place that is really targeted at showing incrementality in terms of revenue, in terms of lift. I'm quite frankly, I personally am not a big fan of multi-touch attribution for exactly that reason. Ultimately, what matters is what comes out at the end, which is increase in revenue.
All right, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you again to Ross for joining me in the studio, and a very special thank you to Severin and the team at Mountain. Our eMarketer studio team behind the scenes also deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. Before we wrap up, let me take a moment to let you know what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for more live analyst and Tuck Talk webinars on our events page at eMarketer.com/events. On the audio side of the house, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers eMarketer's daily podcast. And finally, please check out our newsletters. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.